Halito, and welcome to Native Chalk Talk, a podcast by natives for all. Here we're keeping our Native ancestors' stories and history alive, while also sharing with you our Native culture, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And I hope you'll do me a favor. Feel free to like and share these episodes. I so appreciate it. Yakoki.
You're listening to part 2 of this series.
Part of why I love to study meteorites so much is because they are these gifts from our Creator. Creator has put into each rock a story, just waiting for us to uncover them.
See and share our stories at togetherwe'remore.com.
As mentioned earlier, 88 years after the massacre, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was enacted in 1978. So, do you feel it's a true statement that this act was spurred by the American Indian movement?
I do. I mean, I think obviously with any law, there's a lot of contributing factors, but I do think that the cluster of incidents you're talking about, raised
Hmm.
awareness and produced a number of pieces of legislation, including this one.
Interesting. And I hope that they saw that as a victory, that what they did actually did make some difference. What can you tell us about the American Indian Religious Freedom Act?
Yeah, it's uh so let me I guess it's a complicated story. On the one hand, it's incredibly important because it was, as I said earlier, this reminder that the constitutional promise of religious freedom belongs to everyone. And
Mm.
so it represented Congress's declaration of kind of policy that um, the national government should take care to, avoid despoiling Native American sites, to try to repatriate um, Native American artifacts, to respect Native American religious exercise. So that was all, in my view, good. The weak spot was that it didn't really have much teeth in the sense that it was a declaration of principle and a declaration of goals and a declaration of policy, but it didn't necessarily create the opportunity for people to vindicate their rights in court. Um,
Ah, okay.
yeah, it said a lot of stuff, but sometimes you got to be able to take it to court and vindicate your rights as well.
Right.
So we do have laws that are available to do that, and there's a whole lot of federal laws, state laws, and of course we have federal statutes that enable people to vindicate their constitutional rights. So I think I don't want to denigrate the act at all. I think it was important, but it's a reminder to all of us, I think, that it's one thing to say we value these things. It's another thing
Mm.
to give people the opportunity to vindicate these rights. And of course, we need lawyers like your daughter who are going to be trained to be able to do this sort of stuff. Another federal law that was enacted in the 90s, it should be seen as kind of a follow-up. It was the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which is a very tedious name, but um, it because it focused on land use, it
Yeah.
gave people the ability to go to court to vindicate religiously motivated land use claims. Now, a lot of these claims involve, like, again, garden variety. One of the most famous cases was a Catholic church in Texas that wanted to do a reconstruction project, and the city was telling them no, and or like zoning laws often get in the way of churches, stuff that, again, maybe we're familiar with. But the RLUIPA, that's what the act is called, RLUIPA, is also available as a meaningful, maybe a little more teeth. It's like the teeth that the original act didn't really provide, to get into
Mm.
court and to vindicate, or to try to vindicate Native American land claims. Now, if you remember a couple minutes ago, I was talking about this Ling case. That's still lurking in the background, even after both of these two laws that we're talking about.
Oh,
Courts have
really?
courts have a tough time conceptualizing the burden on Native American religious practice when the government is using its own land, right? Because
Mm.
you know again, I'm a Roman Catholic. Let's say uh, I see that the government is going to build, a really ugly building, and Catholics like pretty art, and so, but I can't sue and say, hey, don't build that ugly building. It offends my Catholic beliefs in pretty art. I I,
Right, right.
I don't have a claim. That's obviously not the kind of
Should be
claim.
against the law. No,
Yeah,
it's just
don't get me started. But what we're struggling with is trying to figure out a way to conceptualize the way that land use can implicate the freedom of religion just as much as like a direct regulation of your conduct or a fine, or you think of the old days, you got thrown in prison if you were the wrong religion. What we're still working on is getting land use into that full picture of what religious freedom is.
right. Very fascinating. These are areas that I hadn't even touched yet in my research. And this is why they pay you the big bucks and why you're here to help me understand all of this. So it sounds like there's a lot of challenges with protecting those rights. Well, okay, so don't hate me. I know you graduated from Yale Law School, but I have to say the H word. I've been reading from, please promise me we'll still be friends. But I've been reading from the Harvard Law Review, in which Kristen A. Carpenter reviews Professor Michael McNally's Living the Sacred: Indigenous Peoples and Religious Freedom Defend the Sacred, Native American Religious Freedom Beyond the First Amendment by Michael D. McNally, Princeton University Press, 2020. And you're listed in the footnotes, by the way, which you probably know that. But anyway, quoting from the review, ultimately, McNally lands on the concept that the religion of American Indians is tied to their peoplehood or their collective identity and self determination. And this is a powerful frame, as I've argued before, in part because it reflects widespread viewpoints of Indigenous peoples that their survival depends on the ability to practice certain religious traditions and ways of life. Many Indigenous peoples' religious practices center on sacred sites and resources, including plants, animals, mountains, and other features of the natural world, as you've been saying, that have sacred meaning. And that really is something to think about, that survival depends on their religious freedoms. What are your thoughts on this? I know you've already talked a little bit about it, but anything to add?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. And notwithstanding the Harvard thing, it's still really important. Um, so, I talked a little earlier about this kind of uh, not contradiction is the wrong word, but belief versus space, right?
Mhm.
Um, the McNally book and the review you just mentioned reminds us of another kind of, is tension the right word, but another point of contrast. A lot of people, and again, in American tradition, a lot of American Protestant Christianity thinks of religion as an individual thing, right? Religion is about what goes on in your brain. It's your relationship with, in the Protestant case, with Jesus Christ, right? It's about
Mhm.
your beliefs. Your, are you saved or are you damned, right? It's you. But for a lot of people, and for a long time in the world's history, people have thought of religion in more of a communal way, right? We can think of Judaism is like this. Um, Catholicism tends to be more communitarian than some in more individualistic forms of American Protestantism. Um, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of indigenous religious practices, and in particular, a lot of the religious traditions of the Native American tribes, did have more of this communal, you mentioned people, dimension, right? And this is one of the really interesting things that's happening in American constitutional law in a lot of areas, I think, is that the court is becoming more sophisticated, I think, in
Yeah.
appreciating the fact that we're not just individuals, we're parts of communities and groups and associations and tribes and churches and universities. And we need to think about people as being embedded in these groups, in these communities. And again, for Native Americans, I think that's a familiar fact, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's something the law has been moving towards. And one of the most famous religious freedom cases, really in all of American history, it didn't involve Native Americans. It involved the Amish. It was a case called Yoder from the early 1970s. Um, and I'd encourage listeners to go look it up. It was one of the court's, I think, most perceptive opinions, appreciating the fact that when you're thinking about the freedom of religion, you have to think about the ability of a community. You have to think about the ability of parents to pass on their children, of traditions to be transmitted from generation to generation. Again, it's not just
Yeah.
about a person's individual belief. So again, I'll forgive the Harvard connection. I think that McNally quote you read is really important. We need to remember that religious freedom has a communitarian dimension, as well as an individual.
It really does. And I love that, the idea that that is something we all need to recognize. And also, if you don't have the spaces, for instance, my family's land allotments are in Wayne, Oklahoma, McLean County, and we still have that land, and we ranch on it. I say we, my uncles do most of the work, but we go enjoy that land. But that is our gathering place, and that is where we come back together. And my aunt always talks about the idea that there might be some of us that come and go from the family here and there. We're finding ourselves, we're going through hard times, whatever it is, but we can always come back to that land when we're ready and when we need each other and when we need community. No matter what religion you practice, no matter what ethnicity you are, if you have that place, you will come together and heal and grow things, grow animals, wheat, grow crops, whatever the case is.
Your use of the term of the idea of family, I think, is so important. I mean, um, if we want to understand what the free exercise of religion involves, again, we have to go beyond just what's in my head, what's in the individual person's head. We have to think about the ability
Yeah.
of communities to form the next generation, parents to teach their children. Um, and for a
Yes.
lot of us, that's going to involve connections to communities and connections to land, connections to place,
So
connections to
true.
sacred space. And I think the law is getting better in this respect. I mean, look, um, I make this joke with students a lot. Like, religious freedom is really easy if everybody believes the same thing, because then
True.
everybody understands it. One of the great things about the American religious freedom experiment, and it was an experiment. We were the first political community to really try to do this, um, and we've been trying to slowly making progress over the decades and centuries. Is that we're pluralistic. We have different beliefs in this country, and some of them are familiar to us, and some of them are different. And so one of the challenges for a legal system is how to manage differences, how to manage pluralism. And
Yeah,
I
it's not
think,
always black and white, right?
yeah, yeah. And I think one of the ways, and I know I'm a broken record here, is one of the ways in which we really see this pluralism is because for some people, these connections to place and connections to community are just as important as kind of individualism and autonomy.
Hmm. The courts are getting better about recognizing these things. And again, it's kind of a feely thing. It's not necessarily a tangible thing, black and
Right.
white and all that. So, and even if you think about it, like in my religion and Christianity, there's also interpretation of, say, the scriptures. So in everything, there's some kind of interpretation of something. And that's why we have the courts, because somebody has to finally make a decision to say, okay, this is the direction we're going on this. Thank you for all making your cases. On this point, how do you think the government's desire for land was tied to the termination of Native people's religious beliefs back in the day?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So one wants to be careful here because when we talk about the government, there's lots of different actors and people have different motivations and different beliefs and all of that. So, but with
True.
that caveat in mind, it seems clear to me anyway that a policy of wanting to, um, you know, expand the territory of the United States and in particular to kind of expand um, agricultural use, across the plains and in other areas, a desire to kind of impose uh, legal property rights that would make economic development, we thought, more likely to impose it on people who maybe weren't using those same kinds of land use laws. All of those ambitions came into conflict with people who thought, no, um, this land has religious significance for us. It's not just we don't like
Mm.
we don't think about it maybe in the same ownership way that you do. We don't necessarily think about land as something just to be farmed and homesteaded the way that you do. So I think for some people, I don't want to say for everybody, but for a lot of people, and I think for federal policy in many instances, the the religious attachment that many Native Americans had to land was something that was getting in the way. It was getting in the way
True.
of
Yeah.
expansion and development. So that resulted in all kinds of policies that I know your listeners are familiar with, whether it's allotment or, removal and all these kinds of things. Again, I think there were efforts in the 70s to kind of turn back a bit to more self-determination and so on. But in many ways, the damage was done, you might say. So to circle back to your point, it's clearly the case that religious beliefs that attached people to the land got in the way of the federal government's aims in terms of economic development and territorial expansion. That's just
Yeah.
that's part of our history.
So true. And I don't know how it could not get in the way. There was
No,
a
and it's not unique to us. I mean,
true.
we have our history, our broken treaties, our and our wars and our tragedies. We're not the only folks who did this. In a sense, our experiences with these dynamics are more recent than a lot of other places in the world.
True.
Nobody's sitting around thinking about, geez, what did the Normans do to the Saxons or whatever, Um, but
Right.
this is a story that people in Canada know, people in Australia know, people in South America have. It's a global thing. It's not just the United States, but clearly, if you think about the Industrial Revolution and um, new ways of thinking about economic productivity, if you have people who are just attached to land and to the sacredness of land, that's going to be an obstacle. And
There's going to be
I think
conflict.
yeah, it's going to be conflict.
Absolutely. The Harvard Review states federal policy from 1883 to 1934 criminalized indigenous religions through regulations and programs prohibiting Indian dances, prayers, and feasts, as well as the practices of medicine. The idea was that by punishing Indians for practicing heathenist traditions, Indians would abandon their religions and the government and churches would facilitate their assimilation into white society. Federally funded boarding schools used the same logic when they forbade Indian languages and cut children's hair in order to, quote, kill the Indian to save the man, end quote. So the government continued breaking treaties and taking over land that contained cemeteries and religious sites, which meant the land with these sacred sites became public land, correct?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're touching on a number of really important things there. So there's at least two layers. One is just all of these treaty relationships that, at least in my view, were often not respected.
Yeah.
Um, and it's interesting to remember, the national government, the federal government of the United States, made the choice to engage in treaty relations with the Native American tribes. You could imagine in some other parts of the world, they didn't bother signing treaties. They just, mowed over
True.
or subjugated them or whatever. We made treaties, but then we broke most of them. Another really important theme is that during the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there was a whole lot of immigration happening into the United States from Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and a lot of Americans were really worried about this. In particular, they were worried about Jewish and Catholic Europeans coming in. Could they be real Americans? So the Irish, the Italians, and so on. You can kind of put this aggressive assimilation effort that was directed and imposed on Native Americans as part of the same story. There was just this sense that if we're going to build America, Everybody
Right.
needs to assimilate, whether they're Irish people who are Catholic and have these weird beliefs about popes and stuff like that, or whether they're Native Americans who have these weird beliefs about land, or the Mormons were a big threat to this idea. This is something you can see. Different. It's a book with lots of different chapters. Is this
Right.
story of assimilation, and I think a lot of it was about insecurity. There was a sense that we can't be a real nation if we're divided. We were just coming out of a civil war. We'd seen what divisions could do. And I think at our best, and this is where I hope we're moving and where I think have made some progress, is to understand that you can have a nation, a country, a political community that still honors pluralism.
Hmm.
That we need some assimilation, right? I think we want Americans to buy into certain things about what it means to be American. We're just coming after the Fourth of July and all that good stuff. Um, but I think hopefully we've gotten beyond this kind of defensive and nervous fear of difference, where we don't
I
think that
agree.
total assimilation is necessary to have a political community.
Right. That we all don't have to think the same and do all the same things and practice the same culture. We can have the commonality of all being Americans, but we can still also bring really cool things to the table with all our differences, I think is what I'm hearing you say.
That's my view. I think that's our
Yeah.
aspirations at their best.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I can only imagine how painful it must have been for Native people to see these sacred lands, and it's still painful today, disrespected. But things did begin to change. Could you tell us about how that shift came about?
Well, I don't want to overstate the shift. um, I think these acts like the American Indian Religious Freedom Act and the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Person Act have been really positive steps. But
Mhm.
it is still the case. We have litigation going on around the country right now about
Yeah.
um, uh, governmental land use that is interfering with Native American religious traditions and beliefs, and it remains to be seen how that balance is going to be struck. Again,
Yeah.
um, lawyers or law professors are famous for always saying, "Well, it depends," or "on the one hand, on the other." I'm sure I drive your daughter crazy when I do this. Um, this is an example of that. Like
Yeah.
on the one hand, it can't be that the government has to make sure that it never uses its land in a way that nobody disapproves of, or did I say
Yeah.
that right? On the other hand, if we're going to respect pluralism, the government should be sensitive to this and should at least try to avoid using its land in ways that
Mhm.
bump up against traditional practices. And again, I do think there's more sensitivity to that in a lot of places, and certainly more sensitivity than there was 50 to 100 years ago. But we're not there yet.
So there was the American Indian Religious Freedom Act amendments of 1994, which allowed members of the Native American Church to use peyote in religious ceremonies. So
Yeah.
let's back up a bit and talk about the Native American Church and peyote. According to the Encyclopedia of Oklahoma History and Culture on the Oklahoma Historical Society website, in the 1870s, a new religion based on the ritual consumption of peyote formed on the reservations of Southwest Indian Territory, present Oklahoma. Lophophora williamsi is a small, spineless cactus that grows on the caliche rich bluffs of the Rio Grande Valley in Texas and throughout the northern plains of Mexico. Called peyote from the Aztec word peyotl, it has been used as a physical and spiritual medicine by the Indians of the Americas for thousands of years. The structure and content of peyotism drew upon earlier ceremonies from northern Mexico and traditional theologies from the southern plains cultures. In the early 1880s, the ceremony, ritual instruments, and core doctrine of the modern peyote religion became more uniform, and the religion spread to other tribes within the territory. On October 10th, 1918, an intertribal coalition of peyotists achieved legal definition for their religion through the incorporation of the Native American Church of Oklahoma. Much of the theological interpretation and spiritual belief of the Native American Church is highly individualized, with the conservative ritual providing a sacred setting for personal introspection and meditation. Basic creed of reverence for universal nature and the tenets of faith, hope, love, and charity characterize the collective doctrine. The Native American Church is a religion of diffusion that accommodates a wide range of local traditions and practices. Congregations and even individual members incorporate differing degrees of Christian theology and Indian symbolism in their practice of peyotism. The ritual setting for Native American church ceremonies, or meetings as members refer to them, is generally a teepee erected for the purpose of the service. A crescent shaped altar is constructed of clean soil in the center of the teepee, with the crescent opening to the east. The religious service consists of an all night ceremony that includes a ritually maintained fire, rounds of individual singing, prayers, and the use of peyote as a holy sacrament. Individuals referred to as roadmen, who are well experienced in the ceremonies of the church and respected members of their communities, lead the religious services. Typical reasons for holding services of the Native American Church include the desire to cure illness, to celebrate birthdays, Christian holidays, New Year's Day, Veterans Day, and entrance into a graduation from school, and to commemorate funerals, marriages, and any other significant event in the lives of the participants. A stated purpose is not required to hold a church service, and many times they are held for the same reasons people worship in any religion: to seek guidance and direction, to give thanks, and to ask for forgiveness and deliverance. Today, many services are held on Saturday evening to accommodate the participants' work schedules. Despite medical and cultural evidence to support the religious use of peyote as both safe and moral, peyotists have been the targets of numerous organized efforts to prevent their use of the substance. Weathering this persecution, the Native American Church has successfully represented its members in establishing legislative and legal means at federal, state, and local levels to protect the use of peyote as a religious sacrament. For hundreds of thousands of American Indian people, the Native American Church has provided the spiritual and social foundation for creating meaningful lives amid the disruptions and dislocations of 20th century life. The story of the Native American Church is one of cultural survival, social adaptation, and moral revitalization. So, from what I've read, protection for the use of peyote in religious ceremonies is provided by IRFA and RIFRA, but it's been a continuous scenario. How so?
Yeah, so let's go back a couple years before the amendment. There was a Supreme Court case called Employment Division versus Smith, which was a huge controversial cause. But in that case, the Supreme Court, nutshell version, said that the government could prosecute you for illegal drug use, even if that illegal drug use was part of your religious ceremony. These were guys. Al Smith was using peyote as part of the religious ceremonies of his church, the Native American Church. And after the Supreme Court ruled, interestingly, there was a real political backlash. Congress passed this really important landmark law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which we call RFRA, which was basically a response to the Supreme Court. It said, okay, Supreme Court, you've said there isn't a constitutional right to have an exemption from a drug law. We're going to create a statutory right. And this is really one of the most important pieces of legislation dealing with religious freedom really in American history.
Oh, really?
And in addition to that, Congress, in kind of a focused way, um, dealt with the specific issue of the Smith case, namely the use of peyote. And so they said, look, with respect to this particular drug for members of this particular church, and they used the American Indian Religious Freedom Act as kind of the vehicle for doing that. They just amended it and said that we're gonna exempt that. We're gonna make that protected. And there's been other examples of that in history. There's been specific targeted legislation dealing with, for example, bald eagle feathers that are used in some tribal ceremonies and so on.
Mm.
So it's interesting. There's a lot of sometimes Native American religious freedom claims are brought like directly under the Constitution. Sometimes they could be brought under these like umbrella federal statutes like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act or the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. And sometimes they can be very specific, right? Like the amendments talking about in 94. So again, this is where, lawyers who know this stuff can come in handy because it get pretty complicated.
Stay tuned for part 3 of this series.
Thanks for listening to Native Chalk Talk. Be sure to join our community on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and check us out at nativechalktalk.com. Stay tuned for the next episode. You're going to love it. Yakoki. Thank you, my friends.